A bullied teen defended a new kid, never guessing the kid would become his best friend for life. Those words floated through Ethan Parker's mind as he sat alone at lunch, tracing the pattern of scars on his knuckles. 17 years old, and already he'd mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. Hood pulled low, shoulders hunched, eyes trained on the scarred cafeteria table. His daily armor against a world that seemed determined to break him. The cafeteria roared with life around him. Laughter ricocheted off institutional walls, painted a sickly shade of yellow that had faded to the color of old teeth. The smell of overcooked tater tots and disinfectant hung in the air, a nauseating mixture that had long ago stopped bothering him. None of it penetrated the invisible barrier Ethan had carefully constructed between himself and everyone else at Westlake High. 3 years. That's how long he'd managed to survive here. 3 years of avoiding eye contact in hallways, of finding alternate routes to class, of eating lunch alone while pretending it was by choice. 3 years since his father's job had relocated them from Chicago to this small town in Indiana, where newcomers remained outsiders for generations. Ethan pulled his tattered notebook closer, sketching absently with a pencil worn to a nub. Under his fingers, a solitary figure took shape, standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss. His art teacher called his work emotionally evocative. His mother called it concerning. Ethan just called it true. Look who finally decided to grace us with his presence. The voice sliced through Ethan's concentration. He didn't need to look up to know it belonged to Devin Reed, captain of the wrestling team and Ethan's personal tormentor since freshman year. Something twisted in Ethan's stomach, a familiar knot of dread and resignation. "Yo, Parker, I'm talking to you." A hand slammed down on Ethan's notebook, smudging the careful lines of his drawing. The cafeteria seemed to quiet, the background noise fading as attention shifted toward the unfolding drama. Ethan kept his eyes down, a technique he'd perfected. Don't engage. Don't react. Eventually, they'll get bored. But today, Devin wasn't alone. "This is the freak I was telling you about," Devin said to someone Ethan couldn't see. "The one who thinks he's an artist or something." Laughter followed, not just Devin's usual sidekicks, but a new voice. Curious despite himself, Ethan glanced up. Standing beside Devin was a boy Ethan had never seen before. Tall and broad-shouldered with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive-looking leather jacket. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he looked down at Ethan. "Doesn't look like much," the new boy said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar accent that Ethan couldn't place. Something in Ethan cracked, a hairline fracture in his carefully maintained wall of indifference. For 3 years, he'd perfected the art of becoming invisible. For 3 years, he'd swallowed his pride, his anger, his words. For 3 years, he'd told himself it didn't matter what they thought. But it did matter. It always had. "Leave me alone," Ethan said, the words escaping before he could stop them. A hush fell over the nearby tables. No one spoke to Devin Reed that way. No one. Devin's face twisted into an ugly smirk. "What was that, freak? You got something to say?" Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. "Run. Hide. Disappear." But his body refused to move as Devin reached for his notebook. "Let's see what masterpiece you're working on today." I said, "Leave me alone." Ethan's voice was stronger now, steadier than he felt. He grabbed the notebook back, clutching it to his chest. Devin's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. "You know what happens to people who don't know their place around here, Parker?" The air seemed to thicken as Devin leaned in, close enough that Ethan could smell the mint gum on his breath. This was it, the moment when everything would get worse, when the delicate balance he'd maintained would collapse entirely. The new boy shifted, moving slightly closer to Ethan. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Ethan saw something unexpected there. Not cruelty or amusement, but something else. Something like recognition. "Why don't you pick on someone your own size, Reed?" The words hung in the air between them, and it took Ethan a moment to realize they had come from his own mouth. Devin's face reddened. "What did you just say to me?" "You heard him." The new boy stepped forward, positioning himself between Ethan and Devin. "Back off." Confusion flashed across Devin's face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The new kid was supposed to be on his side. "Dude, what are you doing?" Devin hissed. "This is the loser I was telling you about." The new boy shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Doesn't look like a loser to me. Looks like a guy trying to eat lunch in peace." The cafeteria had gone completely silent now, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene. Ethan sat frozen, unable to process what was happening. Why was this stranger, this obviously cool, obviously wealthy new kid, standing up for him? Devin's face twisted with fury. "You're making a big mistake, Carter." You don't want to start at this school by making enemies. And you don't want to start by being an asshole. The boy Carter replied coolly. But here we are. For a moment, Ethan thought Devin might throw a punch. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. But something in Carter's steady gaze must have given him pause. After a long, tense moment, Devin stepped back. Whatever. Have fun with the freak. He glared at Ethan. This isn't over, Parker. As Devin stalked away, followed by his confused entourage, the cafeteria slowly returned to its normal volume. But nothing felt normal to Ethan, whose heart still pounded like a drum against his ribs. Carter turned to him, extending a hand. I'm Carter Bennett. New kid. Ethan stared at the outstretched hand as if it might bite him. After a moment's hesitation, he accepted it. Carter's grip was firm, his palm warm against Ethan's cold fingers. Ethan Parker. He managed, his voice barely audible over the renewed cafeteria noise. Carter slid into the seat across from him, casual as if they'd been friends for years. Nice to meet you, Ethan Parker. That's some serious talent. He nodded toward the notebook Ethan still clutched protectively. Ethan glanced down at his smudged drawing, then back at Carter's face, searching for signs of mockery or deceit. He found none. Thanks, he said finally, the word rusty from disuse. Why did you do that? Carter shrugged, unwrapping the sandwich he'd brought with him. Do what? Stand up for me. You don't even know me. I know what it's like to be the target, Carter said simply. New schools, new towns. I've been the new kid 7 times in the last 4 years. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. Besides, that guy's a jerk. Somebody needed to tell him. Ethan stared, trying to reconcile this confident, easygoing boy with someone who claimed to understand what it was like to be a target. Everything about Carter screamed privilege and popularity, from his expensive clothes to his perfect hair to the easy way he carried himself. 7 schools in 4 years? Ethan asked, curiosity overcoming his caution. A shadow passed over Carter's face. My dad's job. We move around a lot. He glanced around the cafeteria, his expression unreadable. Though this might be the smallest town yet, something in his tone made Ethan think there was more to the story, but he didn't press. He knew all about keeping secrets. It's not so bad, Ethan said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Once you get used to it. Carter's eyes met his, and for a moment, Ethan felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. Are you used to it, Ethan Parker? The question hung between them, simple yet impossibly complex. Ethan looked down at his scarred knuckles, evidence of the few times he'd tried to fight back, before learning that invisibility was safer than resistance. No, he admitted finally. I'm not. A slow smile spread across Carter's face, not mocking, but understanding. He extended his fist across the table. Then maybe we can be not used to it together. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before bumping his fist against Carter's. Something warm bloomed in his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. Hope. Neither boy could have known in that moment how this simple act of connection would change the course of their lives. How Carter's defense of a bullied teen he'd never met would forge a friendship that would span decades, survive heartbreaks and celebrations, failures and triumphs. Neither could have guessed that this random Tuesday in October would become, in their shared mythology, the day that saved them both. But as the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't done in school for almost 3 years. He smiled. Sonurm. The first week of their unlikely friendship felt to Ethan like walking on thin ice, each step careful, measured, waiting for the inevitable crack and plunge into freezing waters. Every morning he arrived at school certain that today would be the day Carter would realize his mistake and gravitate toward Devin's crowd, where he naturally belonged. But each day Carter sought him out, sitting beside him in their shared English class, joining him at his solitary lunch table, walking with him to the parking lot after school. By Friday, the shock of seeing them together had begun to wear off among the student body, replaced by confused acceptance and the occasional whispered speculation. They're saying you paid me to be your friend, Carter said as they walked home that Friday afternoon, his breath visible in the crisp October air. Fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet, a symphony of amber and crimson against the gray sidewalk. Ethan snorted. With what money? My vast fortune of minimum wage earnings from the convenience store? I told them you're blackmailing me with compromising photos. Carter replied with a perfectly straight face. Much more believable. For a moment, Ethan felt the old panic rise, the fear that had become his constant companion. Then he caught the twitch of Carter's lips, the gleam in his eyes, and something unexpected bubbled up from his chest. Laughter. Real, genuine laughter that felt like breaking through a surface after being underwater for too long. Carter grinned, nudging Ethan's shoulder with his own. There it is. I was beginning to think you didn't know how. How what? How to laugh. The words should have stung, but somehow they didn't. Perhaps because they were true. Perhaps because Carter said them not with pity, but with a simple recognition of fact. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past identical suburban houses with neatly trimmed lawns and Halloween decorations beginning to appear on porches. Ethan had always hated this walk, the exposed feeling of being visible, alone, an easy target. But with Carter beside him, the familiar path felt different. So where do you live? Ethan asked, realizing he'd never asked before. Oak Ridge Apartments. Carter replied, gesturing vaguely east. Building C. Ethan stopped walking. Oak Ridge? But that's... He trailed off, not wanting to say what everyone in town knew. Oak Ridge was where people lived when they had nowhere else to go. The apartments were run down, the rent cheap, the turnover high. Carter met his gaze evenly. Not exactly what you pictured? Ethan shook his head, feeling heat rise to his cheeks. Your clothes, your phone, I assumed that my family has money? Carter's smile turned wry. We did once, before my dad lost his job. Before the drinking got bad, he kicked at a pile of leaves, sending them scattering. Before my mom left. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Ethan stood very still, afraid that any movement might break this fragile moment of trust. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words inadequate but sincere. Carter shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. It is what it is. Dad found work at the factory here. Says this time will be different. Says we'll stay put for a while. He laughed, but it held no humor. He always says that. Ethan thought about his own home. Not fancy, but stable. His mother's nursing job that kept food on the table. His father's quiet presence in the evenings, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed engineering reports. The arguments they had were ordinary, mundane, about curfews and college applications and the dishes in the sink. You can come over to my place, Ethan offered suddenly. If you want. My mom always makes too much food on Fridays. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Carter. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd invited anyone to his home. Couldn't remember the last time he'd wanted to. Carter's face brightened, the shadow lifting from his features. Yeah? You sure your parents won't mind? They'll be thrilled, Ethan said, and knew it was true. His mother had been asking about his sudden change in demeanor all week, her eyes lighting with cautious hope when he'd mentioned Carter's name. They changed direction, heading toward Ethan's neighborhood instead. As they walked, something shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained giving way to something more solid, more real. What was all that about with Devin anyway? Ethan asked. How did you end up with him that first day? Carter sighed, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. Typical new kid stuff. The principal assigned him to show me around. I think it's their way of trying to reform the bullies. Give them some responsibility. He shook his head. Devin spent the whole morning telling me who was worth knowing and who wasn't. According to him, you were definitely in the wasn't category. Ethan winced. And yet here you are. Here I am, Carter agreed. Because when Devin pointed you out, all I could think was that you looked exactly how I felt every time we moved to a new town. Before I learned to fake it, Ethan glanced at him. Fake what? This. Carter gestured to himself. The confident posture, the easy smile. The whole I'm totally fine, I definitely belong here act. It's easier than letting people see you're scared. The words struck Ethan like a physical blow. He'd spent so long believing he was the only one who felt that way. The only one who had constructed an entire persona as armor against the world. I used to fight back, Ethan admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. When the bullying first started, I thought if I just stood up for myself, they'd leave me alone. He flexed his hand, the old scars on his knuckles white against his skin. But it only made things worse. So I learned to disappear instead. Carter nodded, understanding in his eyes. Different strategies, same goal. They turned onto Ethan's street, a row of modest but well-maintained homes with driveways and small front yards. Halfway down the block, Ethan stopped in front of a two-story house with blue shutters and a basketball hoop mounted above the garage. This is me, he said, suddenly nervous. It had been so long since he'd brought a friend home that he couldn't remember the protocol. Did he just walk in? Should he knock first? Carter saved him from his indecision by bounding up the front steps. "Race you inside." He called over his shoulder, his earlier vulnerability replaced by boyish energy. Ethan followed, something warm unfurling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like a normal teenager bringing a friend home after school. Not the bullied kid, not the loner, not the freak, just Ethan. As they burst through the front door, laughing and out of breath, Ethan's mother appeared in the hallway, surprise and delight written across her face. "Mom," Ethan said, suddenly shy. "This is Carter." "Carter, this is my mom. Mrs. Parker," Carter said, extending his hand with surprising formality. "It's really nice to meet you." Ethan said Friday dinners are kind of a big deal around here. Ethan's mother looked from Carter to Ethan. Her eyes shining with tears, she quickly blinked away. "Please call me Diane," she said, taking Carter's hand in both of hers. "And yes, Friday dinners are sacred in this house. We'd be honored to have you join us." As his mother led them to the kitchen, peppering Carter with questions about school and his family, Ethan hung back, watching. There was something surreal about seeing Carter in his home, filling the space with a presence that seemed to make everything brighter, more alive. Later, after a dinner where Carter charmed both his parents effortlessly, after video games in the basement and stumbling conversations that grew easier by the hour, after his father had offered to drive Carter home and been politely declined, "I like walking at night, helps me think." Ethan stood on the front porch with his new friend. Weinenwand. The night had turned cold, stars pricking the black sky above them. Neither seemed eager to end the evening. "Thanks for dinner," Carter said, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Your family is really nice." "They liked you," Ethan replied, an understatement. His mother had pulled him aside to whisper how wonderful it was to finally meet one of his friends, while his father had nodded approvingly at Carter's knowledge of basketball statistics. Carter smiled, but there was something wistful in his expression. "It's been a while since I sat down for a family dinner like that." Ethan wanted to ask more, to understand the complicated life that had brought Carter to Oak Ridge Apartments with a father who made promises he didn't keep. But he sensed it wasn't the time. Some stories needed space to unfold. "You can come back," he said instead. "Anytime. Not just Fridays." Carter's smile deepened, reaching his eyes this time. "I might take you up on that." He bumped his fist against Ethan's in what was becoming their ritual. "See you Monday, Parker." "See you Monday, Bennett." Ethan watched him walk away, a solitary figure beneath the yellow glow of street lamps. Only when Carter had disappeared around the corner did he go back inside, where his parents were washing dishes in companionable silence. "He seems like a good kid," his father said without looking up from the plate he was drying. "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "He is." His mother glanced at him, her eyes soft with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite name. "I'm glad you found each other." Found each other. The phrase struck Ethan as oddly accurate. In a school of over 1,000 students, in a town where he'd felt invisible for years, somehow he and Carter had found each other. A bullied teen and a new kid, both wearing masks to hide their wounds. That night, for the first time in years, Ethan fell asleep without the knot of dread that usually accompanied thoughts of returning to school. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that felt dangerously like belonging. Softery. By mid-November, the friendship that had begun with an unexpected act of defense had transformed into something neither boy could have anticipated. What started as Carter sitting with Ethan at lunch became shared inside jokes, late-night text conversations, weekend movie marathons, and the kind of comfortable silence that exists only between people who truly understand each other. For Ethan, it was like watching color seep back into a world that had been gray for years. Hallways that had once felt like gauntlets to be navigated now contained friendly faces. Not just Carter's, but others who, seeing Carter's easy acceptance of Ethan, began to question their own avoidance. The art room, once his solitary refuge, became a place where Carter would sometimes join him, sprawled in a chair nearby, homework balanced on his knees as Ethan sketched. "You should submit that," Carter said one afternoon, nodding toward the drawing taking shape under Ethan's careful hands. It was a portrait of Carter himself, caught in a moment of laughter, head thrown back, eyes crinkled at the corners. Ethan glanced up, embarrassed at being caught. He hadn't meant to draw Carter. It had just happened, his fingers capturing the memory of that unguarded moment from yesterday. "Submit it where?" he asked, already shaking his head. "The Winter Art Showcase," Carter replied as if it were obvious. "Mrs. Sirs, Winters was talking about it in class today. Didn't you hear her?" Ethan had heard, of course, but had immediately dismissed the idea. The showcase was for serious artists, for people whose work deserved to be seen. Not for him. It's not good enough, he muttered, closing his sketchbook. Carter reached across the table, flipping the book back open with the casual confidence that still sometimes startled Ethan. Bullshit, he said cheerfully. It's amazing and you know it. You just don't want anyone else to know it. The words hit too close to home. Ethan looked away, his cheeks burning. It's not that simple. Actually, it is. Carter leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. You're talented, Ethan. Really talented. But talent doesn't mean anything if you hide it. What if they hate it? The question escaped before Ethan could stop it. The fear that had kept him from sharing his art with anyone but his teachers. Carter's face softened. What if they love it? What if someone sees it and it changes how they see the world? What if it's exactly what someone needs to see right at that moment? Ethan stared at him, caught off guard by the passion in his voice. Since when are you such an art enthusiast? Since I saw what you can do with a pencil and paper. Carter shrugged, leaning back in his chair. Look, I'm not saying you have to do it. I'm just saying you shouldn't dismiss it because you're scared. The word hung between them, scared, so simple and yet so loaded. Because Carter was right, of course. Ethan was scared. He'd been scared for so long that fear had become his baseline, the lens through which he viewed every decision, every interaction. I'll think about it, he said finally, which felt like a monumental concession. Carter grinned, victorious. That's all I'm asking. He glanced at his phone and grimaced. I gotta go. Dad's shift ends at 4, and I need to get dinner started. It wasn't the first time Carter had mentioned this responsibility. Cooking for his father, making sure bills were paid, keeping their small apartment running, glimpses into a home life where the roles of parent and child seem sometimes reversed. You could come to my place, Ethan offered, as he had increasingly often in recent weeks. Mom's making lasagna. Carter hesitated, visibly tempted. Then he shook his head. Can't tonight. Dad had a rough week. Better if I'm home. He stood slinging his backpack over one shoulder. Rain check. Always, Ethan replied, trying to keep the disappointment from his voice. After Carter left, Ethan remained in the empty art room, staring at the portrait he'd drawn. It captured something essential about Carter. Not just his features, but the light that seemed to radiate from him, the intensity and joy that had drawn Ethan from the beginning. Slowly, he tore the page from his sketchbook. On the back, he wrote his name in untitled portrait, his hand shaking slightly. Before he could change his mind, he walked to Ms. Winter's desk and slipped the drawing into the submission folder for the showcase. As he walked home later, alone in the gathering twilight, Ethan realized something had shifted inside him. The fear was still there. It might always be there. But it no longer felt insurmountable. For the first time, he was choosing to be seen. All because a new kid had chosen to see him first. The text came at 11:42 p.m., jolting Ethan from the edge of sleep. Can you come outside? Ethan blinked at his phone screen, sure he'd misread. But no, there it was. A text from Carter asking him to come outside. At nearly midnight, on a Tuesday. Are you at my house? He typed back, already sliding out of bed and pulling on a sweatshirt. 3 dots appeared then, asterisk yes. Don't want to ring the bell. Sorry it's late. Concern twisted in Ethan's stomach. In the 2 months since their friendship began, Carter had never shown up unannounced, and especially not this late. Something was wrong. Ethan crept downstairs, careful to avoid the creaky third step. His parents were light sleepers, and he had no explanation ready for why he was sneaking out in the middle of the night. At the front door, he hesitated, then slipped out into the cold December air. Carter sat on the front steps, hunched against the cold, his breath visible in small white clouds. When he looked up at the sound of the door, Ethan barely recognized him. His right eye was swollen nearly shut, a dark bruise blooming across his cheekbone. His lower lip was split, a small crust of dried blood at the corner of his mouth. Jesus, Carter. Ethan dropped to his knees beside his friend, horror and fury battling inside him. What happened? Was it Devin? I'll kill him. It wasn't Devin. Carter's voice was flat, emotionless in a way that frightened Ethan more than the injuries. It was my dad. The words landed like a physical blow. Ethan stared, unable to process what he was hearing. In all their conversations, Carter had painted his father as many things: absent, unreliable, struggling with alcohol, but never violent. He hit you? Ethan whispered, the question unnecessary but tumbling out anyway. Carter nodded, a single jerky movement. Not the first time, but the worst. He looked away, his profile sharp against the darkness. I shouldn't have come here. Didn't know where else to go. Ethan's mind raced. They needed to call the police, or wake his parents, or take Carter to the hospital. But beneath these practical thoughts was a deeper certainty. Carter had come to him, had trusted him enough to show up bruised and vulnerable on his doorstep. "Come inside," Ethan said, standing and offering his hand. "You can stay here tonight. We'll figure it out in the morning." Carter hesitated, looking up at Ethan with his one good eye. "Your parents will understand," Ethan finished firmly. "Trust me." After a long moment, Carter took his hand, allowing Ethan to pull him to his feet. They went inside, Ethan leading the way to the kitchen where he flipped on the dim light over the stove. Enough to see by, not enough to wake the house. "Sit," he instructed, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table. Carter obeyed without argument, which told Ethan more than words how badly he was hurting. Ethan moved with quiet efficiency, gathering ice in a dish towel for Carter's eye, finding the first aid kit his mother kept in the pantry. As he worked, cleaning the cut on Carter's lip with gentle hands, neither spoke. The only sounds were Carter's occasional sharp intake of breath and the soft tick of the kitchen clock. "Does it happen a lot?" Ethan asked finally, his voice barely audible even in the quiet kitchen. Carter shrugged, wincing as the movement jostled his injuries. "Depends what you mean by a lot. When he drinks too much? When he loses a job? When something reminds him of my mom?" He pressed the ice pack more firmly against his eye. "It's been worse since we moved here. The factory cut his hours last month." Ethan sat across from him, struggling to reconcile this reality with the careful image Carter had constructed at school. The confident new kid with the easy smile and perfect clothes. How had he not seen this? But he knew the answer, of course. Carter had been hiding, just as Ethan had. Different masks, same purpose. "You can't go back there," Ethan said, the words emerging as a statement rather than a question. Carter's uninjured eye met his, filled with a complicated mixture of emotions. Shame, relief, fear. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "Yes, you do." Ethan reached across the table, grasping Carter's wrist with gentle pressure. "You have here, you have me." Something broke in Carter's expression then. The careful control he'd maintained even through the pain. His face crumpled, a silent sob shaking his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words muffled behind the hand he'd pressed to his mouth. "I'm so sorry." "For what?" Ethan asked, bewildered by the apology. "For bringing this to your door? For not being who you thought I was? For—" Carter's voice caught, breaking on the words. "Stop," Ethan said firmly. "Just stop. You didn't bring anything to my door except yourself. And that's exactly who I want here." The kitchen light flickered on, flooding the room with sudden brightness. Ethan turned to see his mother standing in the doorway, his father a shadow behind her. Both wore expressions of sleepy confusion that quickly transformed to alarm as they took in Carter's battered face. "Mom," Ethan began, rising from his chair. "I can explain." But his mother was already moving, crossing the kitchen to kneel beside Carter's chair. Her hands, gentle, skilled hands that had tended countless patients in her years as a nurse, carefully tilted his face toward the light, assessing the damage with professional detachment that couldn't quite mask her underlying anger. "Who did this to you, Carter?" she asked, her voice steady. Carter looked at Ethan, panic flashing in his eyes. Ethan gave a small nod of encouragement. "My father," Carter admitted, the words barely audible. Ethan's mother exchanged a look with his father, some silent communication passing between them. His father nodded once, then moved to the counter to start the coffee maker, a tacit acknowledgement that no one would be returning to sleep anytime soon. "Has this happened before?" Ethan's mother asked, still examining Carter's injuries. Carter nodded, his earlier shame returning. "Yes, ma'am. And do you feel safe returning home?" A pause, then a whispered, "No." She nodded as if this confirmed a decision already made. "Then you'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll contact the proper authorities and figure out next steps." She squeezed his shoulder gently. "But right now what you need is rest, something for the pain, and the knowledge that you're safe." Ethan watched his mother work, her movements efficient yet tender as she properly cleaned and bandaged Carter's injuries, gave him ibuprofen for the pain, made him drink a full glass of water. His father moved quietly in the background, preparing the guest room, bringing down extra blankets and a spare toothbrush. Through it all, Carter remained silent, accepting their care with a sort of stunned gratitude that made Ethan's heart ache. How long had it been since an adult had treated Carter with such simple kindness? How long since he'd felt safe enough to let down his guard? Later, after Carter had been settled in the guest room and his parents had returned to bed with promises of serious discussions in the morning, Ethan lingered in the hallway outside the guest room door. He knocked softly. "Carter? You still awake?" "Yeah," came the muffled reply. Ethan pushed the door open. Carter lay in the twin bed, looking smaller somehow in borrowed pajamas, his injured face stark against the white pillowcase. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," Ethan said, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. Carter managed a ghost of his usual smile. "Better than okay. Your parents are incredible, you know that?" "Yeah," Ethan agreed, thinking of how they hadn't hesitated, hadn't questioned, had simply extended protection as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "They are." A silence fell between them, comfortable despite the circumstances. Ethan was about to leave when Carter spoke again, his voice soft in the darkness. "That day in the cafeteria," he said, "when I stood up for you." "What about it?" "I didn't do it because I'm brave." Carter's eyes found his, vulnerable in a way Ethan had never seen before. "I did it because I saw myself in you. Because I know what it's like to feel invisible and afraid." He swallowed hard. "I guess what I'm trying to say is that maybe I needed you as much as you needed me." The words settled over Ethan like a physical weight, not crushing, but grounding. He thought about the last 2 months, how his life had transformed since Carter walked into it, how he'd begun to emerge from his carefully constructed isolation, how he'd submitted artwork to the showcase, how he'd started to believe, just a little, that he deserved to be seen. "I think," Ethan said carefully, "that's what friendship is supposed to be. Needing each other." Carter nodded, his eyes already growing heavy with exhaustion and medication. "Stay for a bit?" he asked, the request so quiet Ethan almost missed it. "Of course." Ethan settled into the chair by the window, watching as Carter's breathing gradually evened out into sleep. Outside, snow had begun to fall, transforming the ordinary suburban street into something magical and new. He thought about how a single moment in a school cafeteria had altered the course of both their lives. A bullied teen, a new kid, an unexpected act of courage, and now an unbreakable bond forming in the quiet aftermath of crisis. Stronger for having been tested, more precious for the trust it represented. Ethan stayed until dawn broke over the snow-covered yard, keeping watch over his friend. The months that followed Carter's late-night arrival on the Parkers' doorstep unfolded in ways neither boy could have predicted. There were police reports and social services interviews, court appearances where Carter testified with quiet dignity about years of abuse. There were difficult phone calls with his father, alternating between tearful apologies and bitter accusations. There were moments when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. Through it all, the Parkers stood firm. What had begun as a temporary arrangement, Carter staying in their guest room while the legal system worked, gradually transformed into something more permanent. By spring, the guest room had become simply Carter's room, filled with his books, his clothes, the small collection of astronomy posters he'd carefully transported from his father's apartment. "We've been talking," Ethan's father said one evening in April, as the four of them sat around the dinner table. "Diane and I," Ethan glanced at Carter, who had gone very still beside him. These past months had taught them both to be wary of sentences that began this way. They usually preceded some new complication in Carter's case, some new hurdle to overcome. "Carter's father has agreed to voluntary termination of parental rights," his father continued, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. As part of his plea agreement, Carter's fork clattered against his plate. "What does that mean?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "It means," Ethan's mother said, reaching across the table to take Carter's hand, "that if you want, and only if you want, we could begin the process of legally adopting you." The word hung in the air between them, adoption, so much heavier and more permanent than the careful language of temporary guardianship they'd been using. Carter looked from Diane to Robert, then to Ethan, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You want to adopt me?" "We do," Robert confirmed. "You've become part of this family, Carter. We'd like to make it official." He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "But it's a big decision. We want you to take some time to think about it." Carter didn't need time. "Yes," he said immediately, his voice breaking on the single syllable. "Yes, please." Diane's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed Carter's hand. "Then it's settled. We'll contact the lawyer tomorrow." Later that night, Ethan found Carter sitting on the roof outside his bedroom window, a spot they'd claimed as their own in recent months, a place for late-night conversations under the stars. "So," Ethan said, climbing out to join him, "I guess this makes us brothers." Carter glanced at him, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I guess it does. He looked back at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Is that weird for you? Ethan considered the question, drawing his knees up to his chest against the cool evening air. No, he said finally. It feels right, actually. Like this is how it was always supposed to be. Carter nodded, understanding in his eyes. For what it's worth, I couldn't have asked for a better brother. The words warmed Ethan from the inside out. He remembered that day in the cafeteria, how one act of courage had set all of this in motion. How defending a bullied teen had led Carter to the family he deserved. How that same moment had pulled Ethan from his isolation into a connection that had changed everything. Me neither, he replied simply. They sat in companionable silence, watching as the sky deepened from twilight to true night, stars emerging one by one. I got my acceptance letter from state today, Carter said after a while. From Macon, full scholarship. Ethan turned to him, grinning. Carter, that's amazing. Why didn't you say something at dinner? Carter shrugged but couldn't hide his own smile. Didn't want to steal the thunder from the whole adoption bombshell. He bumped his shoulder against Ethan's. What about you? Any word from the art program? Not yet, Ethan said, trying to keep the anxiety from his voice. The art program at State was notoriously selective, accepting only 20 students each year. After the winter showcase, where Ethan's portrait of Carter had won first place, Ms. Winters had encouraged him to apply, even helping him put together a portfolio. You'll get in, Carter said with absolute certainty, and then we'll be roommates, and I'll make you famous by being your muse, and we'll take the art world by storm. Ethan laughed, grateful for Carter's unwavering confidence. I don't know about all that. I do. Carter leaned back on his elbows, gazing up at the stars. I've been right about everything so far, haven't I? And he had been, Ethan realized. From that first day when he'd insisted that Ethan's art was worth sharing, to his belief that the Parkers would help him, to his conviction that they could both build something better than the fear they'd lived with for so long. Yeah, Ethan conceded. You have. As night settled fully around them, Ethan thought about how far they'd come from that October day in the cafeteria. The bullied teen and the new kid, both hiding behind carefully constructed masks, both desperately in need of connection. How could either of them have known that a single moment of courage would lead here? To brotherhood, to family, to a future opening before them, like the vast starry sky overhead. Sapunidier, 25 years later. Ethan Parker Bennett adjusted his tie in the mirror of the small back room, his fingers clumsy with nerves. Outside, he could hear the murmur of the gallery crowd. Art critics, collectors, former professors, friends and family all gathered for the opening of his first solo exhibition in New York. Stop fidgeting, Carter said, appearing behind him in the mirror. You look fine. Ethan turned to face his brother, who stood leaning against the doorframe with the same easy confidence he'd had since high school. Though now his blonde hair was cut shorter, his once lanky frame filled out into that of a man in his early 40s. The expensive suit he wore was a far cry from the carefully maintained secondhand clothes of their youth. Easy for you to say, Ethan retorted. You're not the one with 20 years of work on display out there. Carter raised an eyebrow. No, I'm just the one who has to give the introduction speech for the brilliant, but notoriously camera-shy Ethan Parker Bennett. He straightened, checking his watch. Speaking of which, we should get out there. They're waiting. Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. 25 years since that day in the cafeteria, and still Carter was pushing him into the spotlight, still believing in him with unwavering certainty. Hey, Carter said, his voice softening. They're going to love it. All of it. How could they not? Before Ethan could respond, the door opened and Lisa appeared, her dark eyes warm with pride as she looked at her husband. There you are. Everyone's waiting. She crossed to Ethan, straightening his already straight tie with practiced hands. You ready? Ethan looked at his wife of 15 years, at the brother who had become his best friend, and felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. As I'll ever be. Together they walked into the main gallery, where Ethan's work hung on pristine white walls. Large-scale portraits capturing moments of human connection, each telling its own story of transformation and hope. The crowd quieted as they entered, all eyes turning toward them. Carter stepped forward, assuming his role as gallery owner and brother of the artist with practiced ease. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying through the hushed space. Thank you for joining us tonight for this very special exhibition, Connections by Ethan Parker Bennett. As Carter continued his introduction, Ethan's gaze wandered to the central piece of the exhibition, the one he'd kept covered until tonight, the one even Carter hadn't seen. It stood 8 feet tall, draped in black fabric that would be removed at the culmination of Carter's speech. Many of you know Ethan's work. Carter was saying, his ability to capture the moment when one life touches another, when connection transforms isolation into belonging. What you may not know is that this ability wasn't born in art school or developed through technique alone. He paused, his eyes finding Ethan's across the room. It was born in a high school cafeteria 25 years ago today. A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't part of the planned speech. You see, Carter continued, his voice softening with memory. 25 years ago, I was the new kid at Westlake High School. Angry, scared, hiding behind a mask of confidence. And Ethan, he smiled at his brother. Ethan was the bullied teen who had learned to make himself invisible. Ethan felt Lisa's hand slip into his, squeezing gently. She knew this story, of course, had heard it countless times over the years, but still her eyes shone with fresh emotion. We shouldn't have been friends, Carter said, addressing the rapt audience. By all the unwritten rules of high school, we should have passed each other in the hallways without a second glance. But something happened that day in the cafeteria. Something that changed both our lives forever. Ethan's throat tightened as Carter recounted the story they both knew by heart. The confrontation with Devin Reed, the unexpected defense, the beginning of a friendship that had grown into brotherhood. As he spoke, Ethan saw his parents in the crowd, now in their 70s but still vibrant, still the steady presence they had always been. Beside them stood Lisa's parents, and next to them, their daughters. Emma, 14, and already showing her father's artistic talent, and Sophie, 11, with her uncle's mischievous smile. What I didn't know then, Carter was saying, was that the bullied teen I defended would become not just my best friend, but my brother, my business partner, and the godfather to my children. He smiled, emotion making his voice rough. I didn't know that a single moment of courage would lead to a lifetime of connection. He turned toward the covered painting, gesturing for Ethan to join him. And now it is my great honor to unveil the centerpiece of tonight's exhibition, a piece Ethan has kept secret even from me. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, a bullied teen defended a new kid. Together they pulled the fabric away, revealing the massive canvas beneath. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The painting depicted that long-ago cafeteria scene, rendered in Ethan's distinctive style, realistic yet heightened, every emotion visible in the tilt of a head, the tension in a hand, the set of a shoulder. At its center stood 2 boys, one hunched protectively over a notebook, fear and defiance warring in his eyes, the other standing tall beside him, a hand extended in a gesture both protective and connecting. But what made the painting extraordinary was how it expanded beyond that moment, flowing outward in a spiral of interconnected scenes from the 25 years that followed. The 2 boys on a rooftop under the stars, Carter in a hospital bed after his father's attack, Ethan keeping vigil beside him. Their college graduation, arms slung around each other's shoulders. The day Carter gave the toast at Ethan's wedding to Lisa. The opening of their first gallery together. Carter holding Emma as a newborn, wonder on his face. Family dinners and holiday gatherings, triumphs and losses, all flowing from that single moment in a high school cafeteria. Silence fell over the gallery as everyone absorbed the scope of the work. Not just a painting, but a visual testament to how a single act of courage, a single moment of connection, could change the course of 2 lives. Carter turned to Ethan, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You never cease to amaze me," he said softly, pulling his brother into a tight embrace. As applause erupted around them, Ethan held on to his brother, his best friend, thinking of all the parallel lives they might have lived, the isolation they might never have escaped, the connection they might never have found. How different everything would have been if Carter hadn't chosen, in that crowded cafeteria, to defend a bullied teen he'd never met. Later, as the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Ethan found himself alone with Carter in the quiet gallery. They stood before the centerpiece painting, each lost in their own memories of the journey it depicted. "Did you ever imagine back then that we'd end up here?" Ethan asked, gesturing to the gallery around them. The physical manifestation of the dream they'd built together over the past 15 years. Carter smiled, the expression softening the lines that time had etched around his eyes. "Honestly, yes." He glanced at Ethan. "I always knew you were meant for this. I just needed to convince you to believe it too. Ethan shook his head, still amazed after all these years by Carter's unwavering faith. Well, I'm glad you did. He looked back at the painting, at the two boys at its center, frozen in that pivotal moment of connection. Hard to believe it's been 25 years. And still just the beginning, Carter replied, bumping his shoulder against Ethan's in an echo of their teenage ritual. Just wait until the 50th anniversary exhibition. Ethan laughed, but knew Carter was right. What had begun in that cafeteria was far from finished. It continued to unfold in their shared work, in the families they'd built, in the lives they touched through art and community. A bullied teen, a new kid, an unexpected act of courage, and a friendship that had transformed them both, rippling outward to touch countless other lives. A single moment of connection that had grown into a lifetime of belonging. As they turned off the gallery lights and stepped into the cool evening air, Ethan felt that same sense of possibility that had first awakened in him 25 years ago, when a new kid had chosen to see him when no one else did. Some friendships changed everything. Some connections lasted a lifetime, and sometimes the simple act of defending someone became the foundation upon which two extraordinary lives were built.